Hello, everybody. I've got something for you today, which I thought was kind of fun. I went back to the early Amazing Stories issues, and I realized that one of the books that is serialized in issues 2, 3, and 4 of the first volume of Amazing Stories is Jules Verne's famous Journey to the Center of the Earth. Now, I read this book once, a long, long time ago, and I haven't read it ever since, so I figured, what the heck, let's go check this out and see what we've got going on. And I found out there's a lot more going on with this book than you might think on first impression. So the original version was published in French by Jules Verne in 1864. Then there was a revised and updated version, an expanded version that was published in 1867, still in French. Now, the first version that came out in England in English was called Journey to the Center of the Earth. Center, C-E-N-T-R-E. It's English. In 1871. And this is the version, it looks like, is the one that they published or republished in the early issues of Amazing Stories. However, what I learned is that there was an 1877 edition, a second version of the book, that was called Journey to the Interior of the Earth, which is actually a much more direct translation. The 1871 edition took a lot of, let's say, localization liberties with the original Jules Verne, whereas the 1877 edition was a very close translation by a guy named Frederick Amadeus Malleson. The 1871 edition is expanded and contracted in various places, as I'll get into in the spoiler section, but it even has a very different tone and stuff like that. It's a very different read. And I didn't read both of them, but I read bits and pieces of the 1871 localized edition, but mainly I'm going to be talking about the 1877 edition. But I figured I could kind of demonstrate this with readings of the first paragraphs of each of them. So if we look at the 1871 edition, the one that was not a faithful translation, we get something like this. Quote, "Looking back to all that has occurred to me since that eventful day, I am scarcely able to believe in the reality of my adventures. They were truly so wonderful that even now I am bewildered when I think of them. My uncle was a German, having married my mother's sister, an Englishwoman. Being very much attached to his fatherless nephew, he invited me to study under him in his home in the fatherland. This home was in a large town, and my uncle a professor of philosophy, chemistry, geology, mineralogy, and many other ologies. One day, after passing some hours in the laboratory, my uncle being absent at the time, I suddenly felt the necessity of renovating the tissues, i.e. I was hungry, and was about to rouse up our old French cook when my uncle, Professor von Hardwigg, suddenly opened the street door and came rushing upstairs. Now, Professor Hardwigg, my worthy uncle, is by no means a bad sort of man. He is, however, choleric and original. To bear with him means to obey, and scarcely had his heavy feet resounded within our joint domicile than he shouted for me to attend upon him. Harry! 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 I hastened to obey, but before I could reach his room, jumping 3 steps at a time, he was stamping his right foot upon the landing. Harry, he cried in a frantic tone, are you coming up? Now, to tell the truth, at that moment I was far more interested in the question as to what was to constitute our dinner than in any problem of science. To me, soup was more interesting than soda, an omelette more tempting than arithmetic, and an artichoke of 10 times more value than any amount of asbestos. So that's the localized edition. That's the one that took liberties with the translation. Here's the 1877 edition, which is a closer translation of the French. On the 24th of May, 1863, my uncle, Professor Liedenbrock, rushed into his little house, number 19 Königstrasse, one of the oldest streets in the oldest portion of the city of Hamburg. Martha must have concluded that she was very much behindhand, for the dinner had only just been put into the oven. Well now, I said to myself, if that most impatient of men is hungry, what a disturbance he will make. Mr. Liedenbrock, so soon, cried poor Martha in great alarm, half opening the dining-room door. Yes, Martha, but very likely the dinner is not half cooked, for it is not 2 yet. St. Michael's clock has only just struck 1:30. Then why has the master come home so soon? Perhaps he will tell us that himself. Here he is, Monsieur Axel. I will run and hide myself while you argue with him. And Martha retreated in safety into her own dominions. I was left alone. But how was it possible for a man of my undecided turn of mind to argue successfully with so irascible a person as the professor? With this persuasion, I was hurrying away to my own little retreat upstairs, when the street door creaked upon its hinges. Heavy feet made the whole flight of stairs to shake, and the master of the house, passing rapidly through the dining room, threw himself in haste into his own sanctum. But on his rapid way he had found time to fling his hazel stick into a corner, his rough broad brim upon the table, and these few emphatic words at his nephew, "Axel, follow me." I had scarcely had time to move when the professor was again shouting after me, "What, not come yet?" And I rushed into my redoubtable master's study. Now, as you can see, not only is the content very different, but there's a pretty significant difference in tone and in the way that, kind of things are described. You can tell that these are very different styles of writing. The first one is a little bit more self-reflective and a little bit more self-deprecating, whereas the first one is more, I would say, curious, a little bit shorter of thought. The paragraphs are much shorter in the original translation, in the better translation from the French, and we get differences like in the original, the cook is a woman named Martha, and in the localized English edition from 1871, there's some old French cook who is not named at all. It's very, very different. Not just like changing the characters of the names to make them more palatable, but like Axel is a German young man in the original French named Axel, and in the English version from 1871, they turned him into an Englishman studying abroad. Very, very different things going on here, and so I figure that was worth mentioning. And since it's the first couple paragraphs, it doesn't belong even in the spoiler section. But as you can see, these are very different animals. So I ended up reading the 1877 edition for this review, and I'll put links and stuff in the description for you guys if you want to read either version, because both of them are so old that they're free. Now, what this story is, the version that I read, it is a fantastic scientific kind of a what-if story, with the popular, kind of mixing that, like a what-if story, with that popular travel story of the time, travel story style of the time. The closer translation is mostly written in a very well-understandable style of the POV character Axel. He is youthful, energetic, emotional, fickle, and a little dramatic sometimes, yet he has enough knowledge about mineralogy and the science of geology that he can deal with some terminology when it's necessary. There's not a huge amount of it, but it is there in bits and pieces. And one thing that we find in this particular book is that there's a good chunk of the central third of the book that is written in a journal style rather than the kind of narrative style that we get for most of the book, which is a nice little change up, and it turns things into a very different style for a little while, just to kind of keep things fresh. The pace of the book is consistent and fairly quick. There's always something happening. They're always moving from one point to another. There is, in the French version, there is a little bit more hurry to get to the actual expedition than there is in the original French, which I'll also mention. I'll talk a little bit in more detail in the spoiler section. But I would say that this story has a good mixture of action, tension, and a little bit of exposition, because you do need, for that kind of scientific what-if story, you do need some exposition here and there about what we were expecting versus what we saw. And you need detail on both of those cases in order to understand why what they're observing as they journey into the interior of the Earth is something, interesting or shocking. I would say that this book, the version I read, is a little bit more engaging than Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, which I read a couple of years ago. I found a copy of it at my local library and went through that. And I'm talking about Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, not Michael Crichton's, which is a totally different book. I haven't read that one since high school, and maybe I should. I read The Andromeda Strain a little while back, but maybe I should read some more Crichton. Anyway, one other thing that also is mentioned or occurs in the 1877 version, the faithful version, is that the translator, who again is Frederick Amadeus Malleson, goes through and actually fixes some of Verne's kind of exaggerations, or perhaps they're mistakes, or maybe they're just flights of fancy in footnotes throughout the book. For instance, there's one point where Verne says something about 600 different materials, and the translator is like, I think he means elements, and at the time of writing, the amount that were understood and isolated by man was like 63. He talks about how the ceilings of the colossal caves in America are 500 feet up, and the translator's like, no, it's more like 150, which is still big, but it's not 500. So there's a little bit of that to help kind of bring a little bit more like, oh, Verne was a little wrong about this, or maybe he was exaggerating, or maybe it was a flight of fancy, whatever. But here's a little bit more information about what we actually do know, which is kind of a nice thing to have in a book that tries to stick relatively closely to something reasonably possible in like scientific jargon. If I had to say anything bad about this book, I would say that it has kind of an abrupt Deus Ex Machina ending with very little tail. Like, what I find fun about these books are the tail sometimes. You have a little bit of an extended period where, the things that they've discovered, they have to defend to the scientific community. Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World had a fairly good tale, right? But this one has very little. Whereas there could have been some really interesting stuff about like, he wrote a paper and then this happened and this happened and someone said, no, this couldn't be right. Another expedition went out there and found this or something like that. There could have been cool stuff like that, but it's just not present in the version that I read. Other than that, this is a perfectly fun Jules Verne tale that isn't trying to parody itself like that Hector Servadoc or Off on a Comet book seemed like it was. This is not a parody book. This is not satirical. It's fairly serious and fairly like reasonable about the things that are going to happen. Off on a Comet, I think, was very seriously, very, very determinedly trying to kind of parody or satirize Jules Verne's earlier works, which was understandable. It was one of his later works, and he probably was tired of writing the same thing over and over again, or the same serious thing over and over again, and so he decided to go a little bit more funny. But anyway, this is a fun book. I'll get more into detail in the spoiler section, and, let's get to that. All right, spoiler section. This book, the one that I read, begins with the professor finding an old tome. It is an old tome written by a guy named Arne Sankusinum or something like that. He's he was an Icelandic prodigy from like the 16th century or something like that. It was an old tome thought lost to history. But what happens is that there's like a page that falls out of it. And on that page there is a statement written in, runic, which is a cipher. And, there's runic characters in the original, and the professor decides, well, I'm going to translate the cipher. Liedenbrock the professor pledges not to eat until he solves it, and he also pledges that everybody else in the household is not to eat until he solves it, which is kind of a funny thing to do. Whereas Axel and the rest of the household is kind of more worried about being hungry than actually solving this thing from hundreds of years ago. They don't really care that much. It's kind of a funny development because, Axel spends a lot of time like, well, we got to eat, and if he never figures it out, we're going to starve to death, and stuff like that. Kind of funny. But the other funny thing that happens is that Axel actually figures it out first. In the book, as I was reading it, I didn't really try to translate. I was like, I'm just going to kind of let it flow by. But if you actually look at it, it's fairly easy to solve. There's a couple of stages where it's not easy to solve, and then they give you the second to last clue, and all it is you have to read it backwards, which is not so bad. But what ends up happening is that rather than the professor figuring this out, Axel figures it out first, and he has to figure out whether he wants to tell the professor or not, because he knows that the result is going to be the professor kind of dragging them off on some quest or something like that, assuming he can solve what the actual result of the cipher means. What ends up happening is that the cipher appears to tell them that in order to get into the center of the earth, which Arne Sankusnum has done, they need to go to Iceland, and they need to go to a specific mountain in Iceland, and they need to find a specific place in the crater of that mountain, or volcano, dormant volcano, in Iceland. And by doing so, they can journey into the interior of the earth. Now here we get a pretty decent amount of, cultural information. First, they kind of leave Hamburg, which is where the story starts and ends, and they kind of make their way. I think they make their way to Denmark and then to Sweden, something like that. But basically, they have to get letters of introduction from various people, and then they have to figure out how to actually get to Iceland. And they have to do so quickly because part of the cipher is that the peak of one particular top of the mountain casts a shadow on where you need to go to find the entrance to the interior of the Earth. And so, like, they discover this in, like, the end of May, and they need to be at the top of the mountain by the end of June, kind of thing. So they're in a hurry, but at the same time, there's a lot going on. They have to get, permission from certain people. They have to find a ship, all that good stuff. They have to, prepare all of their provisions and all that. Then they get to Iceland, and we even get a nice bit of kind of like cultural thing there. First off, they start off by meeting with a bunch of the local scholars in Reykjavik, and then they meet their erstwhile guide for the rest of the book, whose name is Hans, and he is what is called an eiderdown hunter, and I didn't know what that was, but fortunately the book tells you. Quote, well, so before I quote, the eiderdown hunter is someone who gathers the down of the eider duck. So, and then there's a kind of humorous paragraph here about that. Quote, early in summer, the female, a very pretty bird, goes to build her nest among the rocks of the fjords with which the coast is fringed. After building the nest, she feathers it with down plucked from her own breast. Immediately, the hunter, or rather the trader, comes and robs the nest, and the female recommences her work. This goes on as long as she has any down left. When she has stripped herself bare, the male takes his turn to pluck himself. But, as the coarse and hard plumage of the male has no commercial value, the hunter does not take the trouble to rob the nest of this. The female therefore lays her eggs in the spoils of her mate. The young are hatched, and next year the harvest begins again. So that's kind of fun. We get to see, who Hans is and what his job is, and yet somehow he's, knowledgeable enough that he's going to be able to get them up the mountain and all that good stuff. Then they travel to the mountain, which also takes a good chunk of the book, and they stop in, like, at least two places. One place they stop where they basically are dependent on the hospitality of a bunch of very destitute farmers. They have, 19 children or something crazy like that. And there's this funny contrast that's set up where these farmers who have practically nothing are extremely hospitable to the professor and Axel and Hans, and basically give them the run of their house. Then later on, they go to another little town, and the priests of that town are the ones who do the hospitality for them. And the priests are exactly the opposite of the destitute farmers. The priests are still pretty wretched, pretty destitute, but they give them basically the crappiest room in the house. It smells bad. It's dirty. They're not particularly friendly to them. They don't talk about, they're not willing to talk about any of the scholarly pursuits that they've done or anything like that. The main character's party has very little fun at the priest's place. And then we get this at the very end of their stop there. Quote, it was 9 a.m. The priest and his tall Megara were awaiting us at the door. We supposed they were standing there to bid us a kind farewell, but the farewell was put in the unexpected form of a heavy bill, in which everything was charged, even to the very air we breathed in the pastoral house, infected as it was. This worthy couple were fleecing us just as a Swiss innkeeper might have done, and estimated their imperfect hospitality at the highest price. So we get a very nice little contrast between the farmers who asked for little but got much, and the priests who provided little but asked for much. And kind of a neat little contrast there for the story. And I thought it was pretty interesting. But as we'll see, a lot of this early part of the book was just kind of either drastically condensed or just completely overlooked by the first English version, the non-faithful 1871 version. I have a chart for that later on so that you can kind of get an idea of where stuff was added and where stuff was taken away. But anyway, let's get back to it. They continue on their way. They reach the volcano. They climb the volcano. This is a fun thing because they have a bunch of guides, and there's this this massive dust storm that they have to deal with. All kinds of cool stuff like that. They finally reach the summit of the volcano, and now they have to find the passage. But in order to find the passage, they need a sunny day, and of course there aren't very many sunny days in Iceland. Not even in midsummer. So there's kind of this question for a little while: are we going to get a chance to see where the shadow of this peak goes or not. Who knows? However, of course, as you probably would have expected, they do eventually have a little bit of luck, and the sun comes out for a little bit, and they manage to find that there's these 3 different, like geysers, or not geysers, but like, places where gas escapes. And one of them is large enough and wide enough, and actually seems to go deeper into the center of the Earth. So and that's where the shadow of the mountaintop points to. So off they go down there as well, and we get a nice little chunk of time where they're like trying to figure out how to get down this like kind of cylindrical pipe, safely. Where there's a couple of rock outcroppings here, but they're not excellent climbers or anything like that. So they kind of have to use their materials and their equipment intelligently. And there's some fun aspects of that I thought were kind of interesting to read. Then they find their way to the bottom of this large cylindrical hole, and they actually find a passage. It seems to go deeper into the Earth, and from there we get another long chunk of the book, which is them basically walking down this long, mostly singular path. But it's actually a lot further than they thought. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. Like, for instance, at the time, and even now, there's the theory that the temperature on average goes up by a certain amount per, 100 feet that you drop down, right? Well, one of the things that they are wondering about in this book is, well, will that temperature increase actually happen? Will we reach the point where, we only go a little ways in and things are so hot that we're boiling? Who knows? We're going to have to find out. And one of the things that they find out is that, no, it turns out that some rock formations are better at insulating the heat away and letting cold air from the atmosphere come in. So they have that, which is kind of cool. We get a lot of geological or mineralogical information about the different strata that they're going through and what kind of fossils you might find there, and so on and so forth. Different types of rock, the difference between like an anthracite coal and a granite, pumice, all that good fun stuff. And we also get a lot of attention paid to like how far they've gone and measurements of calculations of how far they've gone. Like they have to estimate the grade that they're going downward on. They have to estimate how far they've gone in one direction. They have to think about how far they've gone downward. They have to take into consideration any turns in the pathway, all that cool stuff. So there's a lot of really neat, like scientific style stuff going on at this point, which is actually kind of fun and engaging to read. But then it turns out that while they thought that they were going to be able to find a bunch of like hot springs down there to get fresh water from, there's no water at all. And so there's this extended period where they are gradually getting more and more close to having no water at all, to the point where they almost die of thirst. Axel collapses at one point and faints, and the professor gives him a little tiny sip of water that he'd kind of been hanging on to as an emergency thing. And there's some cool character building there. And finally they manage to find that there's like an underground stream that is past a wall from them. So Hans goes up and he takes his pickaxe and he whacks at the thing for a little while until they finally get some water, and that creates a stream of water, which is a little bit unrealistic. That it would probably make the hole bigger and bigger and bigger until it flooded them all out. But setting that aside, they get this cool stream. Not cool, but they get a very hot stream of water that eventually cools down. And it also allows them to be led further downward into the bowels of the Earth, because the water kind of travels along a certain path, and they're like, hey, we don't need to worry about getting lost if we just follow the water. Great idea. So that's kind of cool as well. We get a couple chapters where basically Axel gets lost. He's kind of ahead of everybody for a half hour during the day, and then he discovers that somehow not only has he lost track of the professor and Hans, but he's also lost track of the little babbling brook of water that they created. And so not only is he kind of alone and in the dark and somewhere that he doesn't recognize, he also lost his his breadcrumb trail. And so there's a cool couple of chapters about him kind of trying to figure out where he is, trying to get an idea of where he needs to go. Kind of last minute rescue kind of thing is kind of neat, and it's all good stuff. Axel basically almost collapses of despair and hunger and thirst, but manages to be saved at the last moment by the professor. When he finally awakes, the professor's like, no, stay there, don't get up. If you get up, you'll probably be so surprised that you'll faint again. And he's like, well, why would that happen? And the reason for that is that they have found a like an underground sea, like a giant underground sea. And not only that, but like the whole like cavern is lit by some kind of incandescent, rock stuff or something like that. It's a little bit it's pretty unrealistic, but at the same time, it's detailed and kind of fun. And we also get something really cool here where, like, a lot of the story is written in a way where Axel's voice is kind of a little bit glib. He's not particularly wordy or eloquent about what he says. But when he sees the sea for the first time, he actually does kind of go poet mode for a moment. So I thought that'd be fun to kind of read out. Quote, "If my eyes were able to range afar over this great sea, it was because a peculiar light brought to view every detail of it. It was not the light of the sun with his dazzling shafts of brightness and the splendor of his rays, nor was it the pale and uncertain shimmer of the moonbeams, the dim reflection of a nobler body of light. No. The illuminating power of this light, its trembling diffusiveness, its bright, clear whiteness, and its low temperature, showed that it must be of electric origin. It was like an aurora borealis, a continuous cosmical phenomenon, filling a cavern of sufficient extent to contain an ocean. The vault that spanned the space above, the sky, if it could be called so, seemed composed of vast plains of cloud, shifting and variable vapors, by which their condensation must at certain times fall in torrents of rain. I should have thought that under so powerful a pressure of the atmosphere there could be no evaporation. And yet, under a law unknown to me, there were broad tracts of vapor suspended in the air. But then, the weather was fine. The play of the electric light produced singular effects upon the upper strata of the cloud. Deep shadows reposed upon their lower wreaths, and often, between two separated fields of cloud, there glided down a ray of unspeakable luster. But it was not solar light, and there was no heat. The general effect was sad, supremely melancholy. Instead of the shining firmament spangled with its innumerable stars, shining singly or in clusters, I felt that all these subdued and shaded lights were ribbed in by vast walls of granite, which seemed to overpower me with their weight, and that all this space, great as it was, would not be enough for the march of the humblest of satellites." Some pretty good language there. I mean, generally speaking, Axel is not the most eloquent, narrator, but he does have his moments, which, kind of makes this book even more fun at points when things slow down and he actually takes the time to really observe something. So they basically find this ocean under the earth, and they're like, well, what are we going to do? And of course, the professor is like, well, we move forward. Hans will build us a raft, and we'll raft across the ocean with a sail with a blanket as a sail, which sounds crazy, but it is what they try to do. They get onto this little raft, and they sit there for days and days and days and days and days, because I guess it's fresh water. I don't know. Anyway, one of the things they observe is that they find some prehistoric animals fighting inside in the middle of the ocean. Quote, "No, the first of those monsters has a porpoise's snout, a lizard's head, a crocodile's teeth, and hence our mistake. It is the ichthyosaurus, the fish lizard, the most terrible of the ancient monsters of the deep. And the other? The other is a plesiosaurus, almost lizard, a serpent, armored with the carapace and the paddles of a turtle. He is the dreadful enemy of the other." They see that. They even find this big, geyser in the middle of the ocean. And apparently that geyser marks the position of this little island that they hop onto for a little bit and then hop right back off. As they're making their way across the ocean, this giant storm appears, and it basically, it almost kills them, right? But what ends up happening is that they get dashed back onto land and discover that it seems like they're actually pretty close to where they started. They didn't cross the ocean, even though they really tried. The storm turned them around and pushed them so far back that they ended up somewhere contiguous with where they started. One of the interesting aspects is that the lightning of the storm, there's some ball lightning or something like that. And it's funny because they describe it, or Verne describes it as, quote, "a suffocating smell of nitrogen," end quote. But of course, we all know that nitrogen is 79% of the Earth's atmosphere that we're breathing all the time. Nitrogen is odorless. What he meant is a suffocating smell of ozone, which is a very different gas. So anyway, Back on land, we get a few descriptions, because they actually do stumble upon some bones of animals, some actually alive ancient animals, and even some like hints of ancient humans. They don't really interact with them in any significant way, because they have no way to speak with them, and by that point, all of their defensive weaponry is gone. It got destroyed in the storm. So they have to figure out a way forward from there. And at that point, they decide that what they're going to do is they find a big rock that's blocking a hole, which they think is their way forward. So they decide that they're going to blast that rock open. The problem is that they use up all their gunpowder to blast that rock open, but what they open is not a path, like an easy, simple path downward, but what it actually is like this giant abyss that threatens to suck the sea all down into it as well as them. And of course, they end up getting pulled into this abyss, this dark abyss. And at that point, basically, there's no more agency for any of the characters. They're just along for the ride. They're on their busted up raft, and they're in total darkness. They don't have anywhere to sail anyway. They're in like kind of a there's rock walls all around them. They don't know where to go. But finally, what seems to happen is that what they did triggered, or they were just fortunate enough that what they did caused, or that an eruption of the volcano is going to happen. And so somehow, magically, they kind of stay on this raft, on this chunk of water, as a bunch of like hot lava pushes them further upward until they finally are ejected into the open air of the earth, and they find out that they are on Stromboli in Italy, or around Italy. And so that's kind of the end of the story. They go back to Hamburg, they have a party and a festival in their honor, but unfortunately there's really not that much description of like the reaction of the scientific community. So, like I said in the non-spoiler section, the tale is a little bit missing, but the story is fun, and it has its moments of poetic and dramatic description. It has lots of tension. It has lots of cool things happening. It has a good pace. It's a fun story. So the one thing I wanted to continue to finally do for the spoiler section is I wanted to kind of put this table up and just talk about it for a second. I mentioned that I didn't read the 1871 Journey to the Center of the Earth, the unfaithful translation. But what I did do is I went and I looked for certain events in the stories and tried to kind of match them up. So what I found is that the 1877 faithful interior version, they finished translating the cipher on page 43, but in the non-faithful version, it's page 29. You'll see these numbers, but what you'll notice is that they're very, very all of the 1871 edition version page numbers are way lower than they are for the faithful translation until nearly the end of the book, and they fall behind more and more for the first chunk of the book where they're doing kind of like the traveling and stuff. So what seems to be happening is that the English localizers decided that all of this character development and prep for the journey was not as much fun as it should have been, and so they focused on the actual the time that they spent under the earth, whereas the original Jules Verne version spends a lot of time building up to them going under the earth and spends comparatively less time talking about the things that they're doing down there, relatively speaking. While there's still a lot of stuff in the original 1877, in the original faithful translation, that it's still a fun story. It might be worth reading the unfaithful version and to see what they added to it. But anyway, that's what I've got for the spoiler version. So yeah, let's get on to the conclusion. In conclusion, this was a really fun little book to read. I kind of was worried that it wouldn't meet the expectations that from my memory of reading it a long time ago. I don't even remember if I read like a full version or if it was like a abridged version or what. But anyway, this is a pretty short book. It's not too long. It's not too complicated. But at the same time, it does have a little bit of fun scientific jargon here and there. Most of it's pretty well explained. It's got a really good pace. It's got good characters. This version in particular does focus a lot more on the characters than the localized version, which spends a little bit more time on the adventure part. Though, I don't know exactly what was added or what was removed exactly. But, the English version spends a lot more time on them under the earth, whereas this one spends a good third of the book before they even get underground at all. So kind of a neat difference between them. But it's fun. The main character, the POV character, has kind of a fairly light tone most of the time, but he does have some moments where he speaks poetically and descriptively about something that's kind of awe-inspiring or something like that. Um, it's a fun story. I like the fact that there's always something moving forward, always something going on. There's no real like lulls. There's a couple of points where someone's recovering. There's a couple of bits where they have to do a little bit of exposition so that you know kind of why what they're seeing is interesting. But other than that, pretty solid pace and just kind of fun overall to read. So if you like, what would I call it? Like classic science fiction, go and you haven't read this in a while, go check it out. And if you've only read one version and you can remember which one, go check out the other version and see what you think of the comparison. So I'll put links in the description to both of the versions. They're both over on Gutenberg, so they have the EPUB versions of them, which are readable, at least the versions that I got on the reader that I have. So yeah, that's what I've got. Journey to the Interior of the Earth. The 1877 edition, translated by Frederick Amadeus Malleson. A lot of fun, short and sweet, and some good old Jules Verne to kind of give you a good science fiction what-if story. So yeah, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.